on today's show.
I think the way people really, when you see someone like Oprah Winfrey recently given that speech at the Golden Globe, like if your heart didn't beat faster, you're an asshole. And by the way, like if you for some reason see that speech and it doesn't give you goosebumps, like I'm going to tell you, any one of the clients that we're working with today, you should fire us today.
Yeah.
Because like that, whether you like her or not, she spoke from her soul.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's how we received it. Whether, again, you like it or not, doesn't matter.
Yep.
So that's, to me, the best form of art, where it is like unencumbered, unfiltered, not worried about sort of this human condition, that it's just sort of coming from me, which is actually coming from you, which is the exact same thing, because we are all the same fucking thing.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Creator Institute podcast. Your host, Koester.
Hey everyone, it's Eric. Today we're gonna hear the story of what one author's journey was like when he drove by a Barnes & Noble and realized that the book that he had just launched was a New York Times bestseller and was rated above 50 Shades of Grey. We'll hear from Joe Mechlinski and his story of sort of basically writing and publishing a book that kind of open sourced all of the things his company had been doing, called Grow Regardless, and the surprising kind of impact that had on him and his trajectory, kind of what doors it opened, and ultimately what he learned when he sent a copy to every single member of Congress. Over 500 people received a book, and the surprising things he learned from that experience. What is exciting to talk about with Joe is this concept of sharing your knowledge and what happens when you open source that knowledge, and the positive results that emerge. Joe's now working on his next book, which will be coming out in a few short months. But you hear the story of what it was like to be someone who kind of always had to level up his game. He played football at Johns Hopkins and ultimately was able to use that to develop his first business venture with a co-founder, and has used that to continue to grow. He's been a finalist for the Entrepreneur of the Year award, and ultimately his story is fascinating. Hearing the story from the Baltimore kid done well, and the guy who launched a book who was able to knock the 50 Shades of Grey from its perch at number one. Joe Mechlinski, everyone. I hope you enjoy the interview. It's a great, fun time. I am so excited to welcome my friend Joe to the podcast. Joe and I met, it's almost like a half decade here. We've known each other, and it's been fascinating to see. We've sort of crossed our paths and kind of this broader Baltimore, DC area. And so I'm really excited to have you on today to chat.
Thanks for having me, man. It has been an interesting half of decade. I've never heard someone refer to it that way.
It's a thing now. Now you know. We're going through our half decade anniversary here.
This an early win. I like it.
That's right. Awesome. Well, I want to chat with you today a little bit about your adventures as a human. And one of the things that I love most about watching you talk about yourself is that you always have this very understated way you describe yourself. You're sort of, you're always the guy who sort of says you're fortunate to be there. And you talk about that a little bit, kind of growing up in Baltimore and getting the opportunity to go to Hopkins. So talk a little bit about that sort of that feeling of basically leveling up your game by coming from sort of the, a normal kid in Baltimore into the world of Hopkins. What was that like for you? And what did that kind of make you think about yourself as an entrepreneur and just ultimately as someone who wanted to up his game?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, there's a lot in that question. I think, it's one thing to swim in a pond that you were pretty familiar with. But when I went from the worst high school in Maryland to one of the best colleges in the country, it was a whole new level of anxiety and a whole new level of fear. And you just feel like you're behind. I think, not to like make this like a vlog here, but Oprah says that all the pain and the suffering in the world is the distance between where you are and where you want to be. Like that level of expectation setting that we all do it for ourselves every single day. We are like our own worst critic, and in that particular context, it was a tough 4 years for me. I mean, look, borderline illiterate going into the school, never read a book front to back, never wrote a paper, didn't know how to type, still don't. Academically, I was woefully behind, but it was also just emotionally. I had a lot going on personally. Yeah. My mom was sick. Just again, a lot of personal issues. And, what I learned quickly, both in a good way and a bad way, was to put on a mask. And, that mask was when someone asked me about, my, where I was from. I was with a bunch of really wealthy, smart, stable people. So I wouldn't give them the story. I put on a mask of, well, I am too. I fit in. I belong.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that sort of persisted through my next journey of starting a company where, I was really super young, 23, started a consulting firm. And, by all measures, I'm not suggesting that's a good or bad path, but not knowing anything at all and claiming you're an expert in something is a whole nother story for another day. But again, that mask really, I put on like a double and triple mask for like the next 5 to 6 years of my career of really not opening up and sharing people my journey, because I looked at that as a disadvantage. I looked at it as a kind of a knock on what I knew, as opposed to, really being an asset and an unfair advantage. I mean, when I look back now on my background, there really isn't a consulting firm or someone who's got the story I have. And, it's a pretty cool and unique story. And, I think it's the more that I've been open about it, the more, to your point, we've talked about this in the past, the more really good shit happens.
Yeah. Yeah. It is fascinating. I think that there is this concept of biting the upper lip and just not sharing things. But I think the more you share, the more good things happen, along that road.
Yeah.
You talk about kind of the college journey, and I have a bunch of college students that take class with me and listen to this. And I love the way you describe sort of almost the Piper nature of you starting your first business in college, the painting business that went from sort of this like, hey, I'll use this to make a little money, to your network of over 150 people. Talk about building a painting company with sort of this, I need to make money. And next thing you know, you've created a mini empire.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, I would love to tell you that out of the womb, I was an entrepreneur. I definitely always had a hustle side of me, whether it was like shoveling snow or selling different interesting things in Baltimore City, which we'll leave it at that. Or when I got to college, I was literally eating out of a tuna fish can, and was just, it was out of sheer desperation. And I got a flyer in the mail. It was for basically a franchise to start up a little painting business. And, to me, like, this was my first chance to kind of reset that expectation that we just talked about. So like, this was my warp speed into where I thought I should be. This was, I think also my first time having all these like little side jobs growing up, like steaming crabs or delivering furniture or being a security guard or bartending or cooking, or I legitimately had, at least a dozen half jobs before I got to college. I remember the one thing about me and my whole childhood was I hated being told what to do. I mean, even from my parents, more so than, when you look at if I'm tested for biases, there's two of them. One is I always think that it's possible. And two, I don't react well to authority. I mean, I am the classic case of reverse psychology.
Yeah.
To do it and I'll go do it. I'm easy to program that way. And so for me, starting out with this idea of being your own boss was less about the ego of telling others, and it was more about the space I now had to act on some of the crazy ass ideas I thought I might have. And so, for me, it was understanding how to manage and really, kind of create this, without talking like we're all new agey here, but really create space.
Yeah.
To start to sit back and say, gosh, like from a strategic perspective, it was no different than how I approach sports. The same, like once I understood the technical fundamentals of lacrosse or football, I then started to think about game theory. Like, how do I get there 1 second earlier than the next guy? Or how do I beat that person to the punch, so to speak? And that's why I love facing off in lacrosse. It was kind of a little bit of a bad story in terms of capitalism, a win-lose, but nevertheless, it helped me sort of shape my thinking. And so, painting wise, it was just that. It was, understanding that, most contractors show up late, messy, and charge a shitload of money. And all we had to do was show up on time, clean, and charge something fair. And frankly, the rest of it didn't matter. We were terrible painters. None of us production. To this day, my wife laughs because I can't put we have light bulbs that need to be changed in our house that I'm a total idiot. But what I did understand was, the same thing that, I think many of us were taught in team sports, which is how do you build culture? How do you treat people with class? How do you think about, building something that others can have a part of? Because I think that's, the ultimate creation is when you can create not only what you see in your vision and your strategy and your creativity, but then when you can also do it for others.
It's pretty awesome. And you reference this, you're 23 and you decide to start a business. At Hopkins, it's sort of, doctors, lawyers, business folks, bankers. How did you navigate that sort of, I almost want to call it courage in some ways, to sort of go off and say, I'm going to start this consulting venture when you're in your early 20s?
So you're leading the witness. You know the story.
Yes, I want to hear it.
But so again, I think everyone wants to hear that. Like, I woke up one day and I got the courage inside of me, and I just went from there. And that's part of it. But the other part of it is I've always been pretty good at this, which is surrounding myself with super smart people, which will sound cliche or trite, but if you have ever found yourself at kind of a crossroads and you think to yourself about some significant moments in your life, you likely, the old adage of when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And that could be in the form of people or just events. But for me, I had just experienced 3 massive deaths in my life, which had totaled about 23 funerals at that point. My mom had passed, my cousin, my mentor, and that mentor was the last house we ever painted. I mean, so you just keep rocking out the serendipity here. The last house that my crews ever painted was a disaster. So it was sort of like it began the way it ended, which was a disaster. And this guy was actually an old banker, speaking of IB, and he, would kind of ask me questions. He left the banking world to become a writer. I couldn't figure that out. And he's like, look, you have to do what you love to do. And this is, we're talking late 90s here. Like, what does that mean?
Right.
And he just kept asking me about my story and, kind of doing what you're doing, which is like, look, I mean, this is amazing, but it's a fish out of water. What were you doing at the school? And I said, no, I'm going to go work at Anderson. He's like, you're joking. Like, it's awesome you got the job. It's awesome you got the offer. But I need you to think about that a little bit. Like, I know how to type. You don't. Can you program in C? You don't. Are you going to be able to fit inside of a multi-tens of thousands of people and really be a conformist? I'm like, yeah, look, I just need to make money. And he ultimately was the one that I give all the credit. And particularly right after he passed, I kind of felt like, life is short. The real reality is I was never going to make it there. I think the bullshit that people say is like, oh, you would have figured it out. No, I wouldn't have. I would have. About 6 months in, they would have found out that I was a fraud. I was not the person that they wanted to hire. Mm-hmm. And I think, for me, I just happened to be at the right place at the right time again with a guy who had seen a lot of this unfold and was like, look, I'm an executive coach. I think, you have really good, instincts around business and strategy. Why don't you help me build this model? And again, I think that's a lot of what creation is. Like, it's not, you weren't born Picasso. Right. There's a Beethoven, all these greats that, we aspire to be. And there's so many other people though that have done great things in the world. And I think that's, sometimes their journey starts a little later than others. And I think that's how I feel about mine.
Yeah, I think there's a quote I'm reminded of Deb Millman, who's this world leading designer, and she talks about that it's not about confidence that's important, especially when you're in your 20s. It's courage, and it's courage to take that first step when everyone tells you not to, and courage comes from people around you supporting you and all those things. But at the end of the day, you then still have to take that first step, and I think that's a kind of a good illustration of. The doors were in front of you, and you sort of, there was one that you had to open and push, and it was rocky and those things. And the other one looked pretty clear, but that the people around you helping you nudge through it was pretty neat.
Well, and go with that one more second, because I think the other spot of this is that, and then the people who loved me most thought I was out of my mind.
Yeah.
So I think, as much as the mentors in your life, I think, being able to distinguish, I saw, this was a quote Tim Ferriss posted the other day. In his book, he was speaking to a rabbi, and he said, it's something along the lines of the greatest distinctions you can make in life are the opportunities to be seized and the temptations to be resisted. And I just that struck me in a way that I was like, yep, yeah, I'm sure people have heard that before. And for me, of course I want to listen to the people around me,
right?
But they in that particular, place and time were like, you got to go take the job. You got to go take the job. And frankly, for the next 5 years, as they saw us struggle mightily, would continue to say in a very helpful way, like, look, there's no shame. There's no shame in quitting. There's no shame in quitting. And, back to, I'm a pretty easy coin operated machine. I mean, by everyone telling me to quit is why we're talking to each other right now, 17 years later.
Yeah.
It is that simple. And I think, that begets a whole nother conversation around, well, like, but are you getting like user feedback on your product?
Right.
And that's tough. It's back to like, how do you distinguish between getting good feedback and frankly swimming upstream and not listening to anyone?
Yep.
I mean, I think that's the plight of an entrepreneur.
Yep. I'm reminded of your quote about from the rabbi of the Warren Buffett 25-5. Have you heard this? He basically, it's fascinating. I think it's a really compelling one for us as entrepreneurs, because I think that there's this sense that like part of it is you can make anything look attractive and you can convince yourself it's attractive. And so Warren Buffett was asked, how is he successful? And he says, listen, I've got this every quarter, every month, whatever period of time. He goes and he lists the 25 most important things to him, number 1 through 25, and he ranks them. And then what he says is the secret isn't that. The secret is I religiously avoid doing anything on number 6 through 25. Because those are the things that are going to prevent you from actually achieving greatness and the 5 things you need to focus on. And I think that's a really compelling thing, is to think about it, is that we need to focus, and focus is oftentimes where the magic comes from.
Yep. It's really good for me to hear right now, given the 6 and 7 and later today. But no, I appreciate that. 6
and 7 are the hardest ones. Every day I have to kick myself, and my wife is really good at kicking me on 6 and 7. She knows what they are, and she's like, don't do them.
Right. I mean, but it's fun. I think the other part of this too is, once you start creating, you're going to find, at least for me at times, which is, you'll think you can bend time, and you can.
Right.
You really can.
Yep.
And you can't. I mean, it just gets to a point where you can't. And so whether it's the analogy of how many holes can you really dig deep, or, the 25-5 or the 25 thing from Buffett, I mean, I think it's all good. And I also think, you just got to build in failure. I mean, every single thing you do is not going to be amazing.
Yeah. So I want to transition a little bit here to actually the way that we met was through your book, and I think the book was the way that it connected us through Scott Case, who was my business partner, and ultimately I think it in a lot of ways has positioned you as much an author as it has an entrepreneur in a lot of ways. You've created this book. It has taken this life of its own, making bestseller lists. But I want to go back to that sort of point when you decide to write this book, because, as you said, you're in this middle of this business, and you're running a small business, and all of these priorities, the 6 through 25. How did you decide that was sort of writing a book was something you needed to do that wasn't number 15? It was actually something that needed to be number 3.
Yeah. So the backstory for me to write the book was actually a story of 2008. We were an early innovator in the recession, the Great Recession, meaning that we lost $1 million, I think, way before anybody else did. So, we had to quickly retool the business, which meant, we were in a position of less options. And if it was going to move forward, it was going to have to move forward in a different way. And so my partner and I split after a really long time, and in a very amicable way. But all of a sudden, I found myself at like legitimately the captain's chair by myself with a bunch of really amazing people who believed in what we wanted to do. So, to me, like, this was the perfect moment to say, all right, let's almost burn it all down and build it back up. Let's prove to ourselves that if we follow our own medicine, that if we eat our own dog food, like grab your favorite analogy, that this would work. If it works for us, it'll work for others. And so that's what we did for 3 years plus. Like Monday through Thursday, we worked on client stuff, and Fridays, we made it the day to focus on us. Like I said, it may not work. This may end up failing miserably, but no one's ever going to look back on us and say, you guys didn't learn, you didn't train yourselves, you didn't, you weren't like the most well-trained group of little, management consultants on the planet. Like I said, that will never be us. We're going to be like the Navy SEALs of management consulting. So for 3 straight years, we did that. Imagine Monday through Thursday, basically a work week. And then on Fridays, we brought in people, we meditated, we worked, we strategized, we planned. And out of all those conversations, got to a point where it's like, okay, we can see the light at the end of the tunnel. What's our next stage? Like, how do we get to more people? How do we create more impact? Like, for me, that has always been kind of a very important part of my life, is how am I, how is what I'm doing? Like, when my head hits the pillow at night, I sleep so soundly when I feel like I'm in congruency with what my purpose is and like, what am I here to do? And I think part of that was starting to gnaw at me. And in this way, which goes all the way back to the first part of this interview, which is, no one knew who I was. I just was so stingy with all of these stories because I sort of said, like, who would care about any of this? Like, we're not that special. I have a knack for being self-deprecating. And so not owning our successes, but really like over owning our failures. I tend to find people like me are wired that way. So we're like, oh, it's lucky. I'm fortunate.
Right.
And then when I fuck it up, I go way over the top. Oh, yeah, that was all me. Yep, that was all me. And there's something I think that people find endearing to some degree, but if you get to know me, it becomes annoying because then it almost becomes disingenuous.
Yeah.
And, and this is just self-work here, right? And so in 2011, I'm like, I got to write a book. That's what people do in this space. So, if you want to do some market research, like if you're a consultant, you can either go into government contracting, go work for a big company, or you got to publish a book. And if you publish a book, it's got to be successful.
Yep.
And so, I did my homework. So I went and studied from a bunch of people at the time that were helping authors get their stuff out there. And then, I spent, a lot of time thinking about like what would be really unique and certainly from my heart, like what really could I put on paper that would be, it would be inarguable. Like you might not like the content, the writing might suck, but no one's ever questioned my heart when that book came out.
Yeah.
And that's something to be, for me, that was, I wanted to make my kids proud. Right.
Yep.
So, that was sort of the impetus. And I think from a book standpoint, certainly it's easier to publish, which means it's harder to make it successful.
Right. Right. And I think you go in with this, hey, I'm going to write a book. You sort of, I saw an interview where you say, this became a New York Times bestseller, #1 in Barnes & Noble, and you even beat 50 Shades of Grey. So, like, what do you feel when you see this book that you basically sort of did because you felt like it sort of as a next step? But did you have any kind of like aspirations that it could be that much of an impactful book to you?
So I'm going to no BS. So it took us 90 days, and I say us because I had a team helping me put together the book. 90 days, the manuscript is done. It took me 12 months to figure out if we wanted to have an impact with this book. There's a couple interesting things I learned. Number one, 20% of the people back then, it was just a study I saw, that actually buy a book, read a book.
Wow.
From front to end. So just think about it. So if you sold 10 copies, only 2 of them are actually going to read the whole thing. And so in my mind, because I was back in this sort of purist state of view, is, well, then if we wanted like 100,000 people to be affected by this, like we'd have to sell 1 million. I mean, like 500,000, my math is off, but whatever it is, like starting in a weird, crazy place. That was number one. Number two, there's like 30 plus 40,000 books published every single year in this exact area, which is crazy, right? And then number three is very similar in music and movies, that if your launch is not successful, like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie could get back together, it could have like a hot, steamy romance, all nude, coming out this weekend. But if that movie doesn't finish in the top 3 or 4, it's gone from the studio.
Yeah, right.
And so when you put all of this together, there's one other little interesting thing about this whole industry that I learned. And again, I would hardly call myself an expert in this particular industry, which is, you get graded on a curve, which is exactly how I made it through Hopkins. So, I just got done meeting with a super smart, like computer science engineer guy from Hopkins. I'm not kidding. Like, and just because we have the same degree does not mean we have
right.
Like and that's not even being self-deprecating. That's just being honest.
Yeah.
So I got through that school through multiple choice psychology tests, through economics classes because I was pretty decent at business, and I took other classes where, frankly, the other athletes took because I had to be graded against them, not all the smart kids. No offense. By the way, a lot of smart guys I played football with that are now like doctors and, don't work anymore. So you learn these things. And so, what did we learn and grow regardless? That February in that particular time frame was the worst month to launch a business book. It was after Q4, the whole holiday season, and it's the shortest month of the year. We also learned that the worst week of the worst month to launch, which sounds funny to do, which is the week after Super Bowl. And so, there's this weird storybook ending or storybook, for me is that, that particular year, my son My wife gives birth to our son. The Ravens go to the Super Bowl. I go take my dad down. It was like bucket list item. They win. And then that night on the way back to the airport, I'm checking out Barnes & Noble because we launched that night. And I saw that, it was like 12:30 and I see that we're number one.
Wow.
And then the next subsequent weeks, it was like absolutely amazing. And we knew that we wanted to do something like that. So we worked and hustled and, there's a lot of things that we tried to make happen. And it was only because sincerely, it had nothing to do with ego, the significance, the title, the accolades. It was, if people are going to care about this book, they've got to see that others care. They've got to see that there's some third party, there's some deeming of this by someone else, so that they stop their lives to pick this thing up, to find it interesting. Because if not, it could be like, there's so many awesome books I've read that nobody know about.
Right.
So that's what we did.
And your book was one of those ones too that you really did kind of go into this concept of like sort of putting it all on the table. And I gotta think that, you're running a small business, you're still trying to grow it, you've sort of built up this proprietary knowledge. Did you have this trepidation of saying like, I'm going to put it all out there? I saw a quote that you gave, we shared it all, everything we'd done in a humble warrior approach of even sharing all the ways that we'd screwed up. What, was there this fear of saying like, I'm giving people my playbook. Is this the right time to do it?
So, what's funny about that is, maybe it's because I've always had a little insecurity about not knowing enough or, and I think that helps sort of drive my insatiable thirst for knowledge and hunger of learning. But for us, even back in the day, like it seems so odd to me that I'll give you an example. The fact that we ever thought with the sheer vastness of the universe that we're alone, that there aren't other Earth planets, that until January 2016, this is a thing I wrote about a little while ago. January 2016 or July 2016, NASA comes out and says, we went from June 30, no, to July, of 2016, 1,287 Earth-like planets.
Right.
But even as like a 5-year-old, it just seems to make so much sense to me that we're not that significant.
Right.
I love looking at the beach. I heard, I was listening to someone recently talk about surfing, and it's like, it sort of reminds us of how so insignificant when you see something so vast, right? Like that's what maybe we're drawn to, other than that's where we came from. And for me, like that's the same sort of thing, which is like, I can't possibly think that what we're teaching today is going to be valid tomorrow. I mean, there's never been a time in human history where things are moving so fast. Like 10 years ago, the iPhone, Thomas Friedman's book was amazing, talking about just the perspective and the context of this. So like, to be completely candid, there's no reason not to share because it's all invalid tomorrow. Mm-hmm. Like there's another truth that will be found tomorrow that may or may not be closely connected to what you're talking about. So, if you're resting on that you've created the answer to how to solve the Rubik's Cube, good for you. And if you feel
right.
the test of time, then maybe you should hold back. But if you feel like what you're doing or what you've got to share is going to be an evolving truth that's dynamic, that's growth sort of centered, then I'd say share it, not only because it's only going to be as good as the time frame that people use it for at some level, but the second piece is it's going to make it more authentic. Like I think people are so done with the paid walls, or so done with not being able to get to the truth. Now, look, there's some cool marketing around this, but I think the way people really, when you see someone like Oprah Winfrey recently given that speech at the Golden Globe, like if your heart didn't beat faster, you're an asshole. And by the way, like if you for some reason see that speech and it doesn't give you goosebumps, like I'm going to tell you, any one of the clients that we're working with today, you should fire us today.
Yeah.
Because like that, whether you like her or not, she spoke from her soul. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's how we received it. Whether, again, you like it or not, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So that's, to me, the best form of art, where it is like unencumbered, unfiltered, not worried about sort of this human condition, mm-hmm. that it's just sort of coming from me, which is actually coming from you, which is the exact same thing, because we are all the same fucking thing.
Yep. Yep. You are sharing something that in a lot of ways is this sort of it was a little bit kind of contrarian in some senses, right? You're coming out of 2008 and there's this sort of like, oh, it's unfair, like the world's stacked against us. And you come out with kind of these, in a lot of ways that I would say, sort of simple-ish principles, right? Like we need to learn how to tell our stories better and think of employees as clients. Why did it work? I mean, why do you think that sort of like, these simple concepts just so much resonated at the time and place that it was?
Because it was all said before, and not because there's not at all, as you qualify slightly about simple-ish. Yeah, there. One of my says, it's like common sense principles that aren't so common.
Yeah.
I mean, we know sugar's bad. People still do it. We know we should be more thoughtful and less biased, but we still do it. Like I think we find what resonates with us, that which we recall and we remember most, or we remember at some point in our lives. We don't do well with new data sets and new information that we've never heard or seen before. And I think, that's, to me, it's the reason I watch Rocky over and over and over again. It's not because I don't know the ending. It's like I actually enjoy re-remembering the struggle and the sacrifice, and it helps me sort of maybe put myself back in that place. And I think in business, this gets to, next book and kind of what we're up to, but it's like, I think that's the opportunity. Like, I love what you're doing in your class and hearing more about, how do we reshape kind of the way in which people are working, the way in which people are learning, the way in which people are doing business. Like, I think that's the playground. Like, that's the new canvas, right? And I think that's this crazy, amazing opportunity where things are being disrupted and just innovation everywhere. And it's like, it's an amazing time to be alive.
Yeah. Your book almost is this, like you said, this sort of movement piece in a lot of ways. You have I've counted 15 pages of people giving their blurbs about the book. How do you go about this process? I mean, were there any of them that you're nervous thinking like, hey, I'm writing this book here. I'm looking for you to sort of to give me a thumbs up on it. How do you go about getting, this entire network, a lot of people to say, hey, we want to be back behind this book?
Yeah. So I think, maybe not said perfectly, but the book, and what you see in there is a reflection of work done, not work to be done. I know that sounds like a really subtle nuance, but I want, if you can just unpack that and think about it this way. Those people endorsed us for the work we had done. Those people saw the book as an afterput or an output rather of not theories, not things to be tested, but things that had actually been done and done in a way that were like a win for them, a win for others, and a win for the world. And I think it's not hard to get people on board when you say, look, this could cure cancer. Now, that's not what I'm suggesting the book was promising, but in a sense, this book could cure the ills of, the world and society if people thought about, getting rid of the caste system and going to more of an equitable work environment. If people led with more mission and why, gosh, why would that be a bad thing? And if you cared about market demographics, that's how the millennials are going to buy anyway, just as an early, sort of indicator. And that's like, again, that's like grandma and apple pie.
Right.
Who's going to really debate that? And I think, to your point, it's like that to me is there's nothing wrong with that. Now, in this next book, it's all about how do you say things that have never been said before? How do you use science in a way of trying to, and who knows, right? Who knows what's going to happen with that? But in terms of getting people to endorse the book early, it's got to be a reflection of the stuff that you've done. Now, look, we went out on a limb. I sent the book to Scott. I sent the book to, I went, candidly, I sent it to every member of Congress. So 535 books were sent out. I did that on me because I thought, imagine if, 5 of them call us. Well, 3 of them did.
Wow.
And they were, something to think about. Now, I am wholly aware that meant nothing. that it didn't go anywhere, but back to, it's just the intent behind it. That was, what I told people. I said, look, you're going to be part of this book. I'm going to send it to every member of Congress. I'm not kidding about how do we create this little mini micro movement? And how can we create space? That book was also very purposely designed to go deep into 4 organizations that I wanted to be part of this, front and center to highlight them. And then, the people that endorsed it, tactically we sent out a blurb and we sent out, would you be willing to put a couple words to this?
Yeah. Yeah. How did you decide to send? I mean, I think it's awesome and crazy all at the same time. How do you decide to say, I'm going to send out 500 copies to every member of Congress? What's the like, was this like a middle of the night? Were you drunk? Like, how do you make that call?
Yeah. I mean, this is like the chip on my shoulder, the blue collar kid. Let me in the room, you son of a guns. This is also, though, like my journey of learning about just the system and the politics of, how things are done. I'm nowhere near, again, have learned anything yet, but I was so fed up with, sequestration and watching these things unfold at the time. And, adding this to the subtitle, despite the government, I had actually a ton of people that would said, you're out of your mind. And then to send it to them after that. Yeah. And again, I think, part of this, you learn this from like guys like Branson and Elon Musk, like, you got to check it, right? Which is some of this can come off as ego, and this is about me and significance. And don't get me wrong, I have an ego. It's just not about this stuff. Yeah. But the other side of it is there is a stunty part of this that you just got to get comfortable with. So Peter Diamandis launched his prize, the whole X Prize with no cash. That's stunty. Right. You think about Branson and what he did with the hot air balloons and always trying to put like Virgin Airlines on the front of the newspaper. That's stunty. Well, I was trying to think of like, what's our stunt? Right. And so sending it to them with the subtitle of "We don't need this. We'll do this without you." Yep. Was stunty. That was And yes, I'm sure alcohol was involved. That's good. That's good. Were of the three that got back to you, any interesting feedback from them? Did they like the stunt? Absolutely nothing. I have nothing interesting to share. Like I wish it was like, and they voted this way in the next. No, nothing. They, a couple people reached back out with letters. Thank you for the book. A couple people reached out, and I talked to like a representative in Texas. I have no idea what his name was. And then the mayor of what was that? Was it? It's next to San Diego, La Jolla, Irvine, maybe. Yeah. He had me come out because he was like really pro business, and you can see these pictures. I look so tired and like I'm sitting next to him. Like did a little book signing there, and I was like, I'm with the mayor of like this cool town. And again, he was super, super, super amazing about it. And then look, I looked at other boards. Which, if I'm not mistaken, I looked at the one that Scott was on with Magic Johnson and this is Malaria No More with Peter Chernin and yes, and I'll never forget the moment that I'm sitting in bed laying next to my wife, which is sort of an odd thing to say, that I'm like looking at my email and I get an email back, or I just get an email period from Scott because I didn't have his email. Yeah, and he's like, "Hey, did you send me this?" Like in a real I was like, "Oh fuck!" Yeah. And he's like, really interesting. I think I want to meet with you. And I'm like, this is it. Like we've reached the pinnacle. Like, and he was, as he's really, really super approachable, accessible guy. We sat and talked for a few times. He introduced me to you. And it just also put me, in a place where it's like, someone who's one, this smart, two, achieved this much success, it's what you think a lot of them are, which is they want to talk, they want to help, they want to support. And at the same time, they're saying things that we can't even listen to because I'm doing the same thing to other people today. Like I'm going to be mentoring this woman entrepreneur. She's got this amazing business idea. And I know like 80% of what I'm going to tell her today, she's not going to listen. She's not in the person. Because we're all, that's just, again, we're the human condition. Yep. That's amazing. Well, I think you're right about the elements of it. Is that a big portion of this one is you just sort of get yourself in the room and who knows what will exactly happen from it. And I think it's a good evidence. You put this out there. You were very open about it, and I think people mostly are looking for that authenticity, right? They're looking for people who are saying like, "There's a lot of things I don't know, but let me share you what really I do know, and I want to make it better and improve on those." So I think that's a good example of that. You have to just sort of think that, people are, when they read your book, like we're talking about this from 5 years ago. Yeah. It may not be relevant to me now, but it's relevant to you or it's relevant to whomever. And that's, you got to remember to honor that, I think is important. Yeah.
And so I think you give us a good point to transition. You know, as a first time author, every first time author I've ever met is already thinking about their next book. And so as you've evolved as both an entrepreneur and a business person, a book that was sort of aimed at the early entrepreneur set, sort of small business set, what's sort of the preview of the next book that you're working on?
Yeah, so it's called Shift the Work. It's the revolutionary science of going from apathetic to all in using your head, heart, and gut. So it's this whole idea that, the center of this is to think about employees, is to think about, frankly, human beings, to think about people who don't look forward to Mondays, that a third of our waking time is spent working, and that we are in kind of a world that, particularly in this country, that you should not have to do anything you don't want to do. I mean, there's more job openings than ever before. If you want to learn how to become a data scientist, you can take a free course right now from Harvard to do that, right? Google sponsored these amazing programs. And, never before have you had, sitting in your hand, the answers to the world's problems or questions or whatever the case may be. So if there were ever an excuse to not wait until retirement to enjoy your life, or to not watch the clock tick down one little talk at a time, like, to me, yes, there's been books to talk about find your passion, find your purpose. But what I started digging into right after Grow Regardless was like, what's the science say to this?
Yeah.
As much as I'm not, a science geek per se, I've always been, sort of very, interested in, watching the evolving science, particularly of the brain.
Yeah.
Like, in the last 3 or 4 years, we know more about the human brain and, frankly, the other brains in the body than we've learned in the last 3,000. And if you start to look at how bad we all make decisions. So if anybody's ever gambled before, that's a bad decision, right?
Yeah.
or if you've been with someone, though, who understands how to count cards, good decision.
Yeah. Yep.
And so just at a very basic level, then what kind of decisions do we make in terms of where we work? And so when I started looking into this, I remember the whole idea of following your heart and trusting your gut. These were sayings that were developed in the 50s and 60s when scientists found a neuron network, essentially a brain in your heart and a brain in your gut. And when you do more work around this, what you could connect this, that the baby boomers were really connected to the knowledge worker. It's what Drucker talked about, like the knowledge in your head, the priorities, like how do I learn, my cognition, how do I think for tomorrow? What's interesting about Generation X, as we came onto the scene, is we were all about following this passion, like do something that's fun, foosball tables, beer at work.
Right.
That was what happened in the 90s because, different job opportunities availed themselves, which then created this, unequal weight in the market for talent, which meant you could go get a job, get stock options, and retire by the time you were 26. And if you start to look at the science behind it, it's also, we go from dopamine to serotonin. We talk about oxytocin. This is all biochemical. So if you believe that, when I go jump on a plane next week, do I want to fly with a pilot who's got a lot of cortisol or a lot of serotonin? Said no one ever cortisol.
Yeah, exactly.
You didn't have to go to med school. Everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. No one has to be a scientist. You're like, cortisol doesn't sound good. No shit, it doesn't sound good. And so that comes from the gut. So the idea that, the millennials are now the first generation that are potentially able to connect their gut to their work, which also then connects to this sort of social minded, I'm connected to the collective. I'm not coming from a place of fear that I can't feed myself. I'm coming from a place of fear that I can't find myself. I'm coming from a place of fear that I'm not going to live a life worth living. Well, all of a sudden, this no longer becomes a motivational speech anymore. This is actually rooted in science. And so what I've talked about is this whole idea of your head, your heart, your gut, how you find this at work. And it's really, really, it's just a fascinating subject.
It's amazing. What would you tell if a 21-year-old comes and they're basically have this suite of job opportunities in front of them, or they could pursue their own thing? What do you tell someone at that point? How do you coach them through that? Because I think there's a very, very big set of people who sort of feel sort of analysis paralysis. There's all these things, but there's not sort of frameworks to process those sorts of things. What's the short version that you tell someone at that stage in life?
That's your nice way of saying I'm a little long-winded. So
No.
So I think the first thing that we would so let's go through the head, heart, and gut quickly. This is easy. So the head is about priorities. So to me, if you don't know what your top 3 priorities are in your work environment, in your work journey, in this place that you're going to spend a third of your time. So this isn't pay. This isn't benefits. This is who do I work with? Who do I work for? What might I be doing? What would I be learning? How am I going to challenge myself? If you can't name the 3 most important things to you in your work environment, you're not a loser. You're not being thoughtful. You're not being intentional. You're not being deliberate. And so that will connect directly with the next brain, which is our brain, which is like, what do you really love to do that you might edge out the people around you? Like, do you solve problems in a different way? Are you super creative? Do you understand tech, digital? I mean, what's the thing that you can inch out? Like, what's the way in which you can potentially connect with others? We connect with our gifts. And the way that we connect with others, by the way, is heart to heart, hug to hug. Like, oxytocin's created. It's why our mothers didn't eat us. Like, again, this is all like biological. And then the final thing is simple. It's legacy. It's purpose. It's your gut. Like, how will you know your time is worth it? Like, what will it cumulatively add up to? So we all want to like start changing the world at 23, like the old Rumi quote, which is, a clever man said, I want to change the world. A wise man said, I want to first change myself. Right? Gandhi, be the change you want to see in the world. So this one is where Simon Sinek has really done a great job of like, getting all the millennials to say, hey, just work first, change the world later. And I think that's part of it, which is if you're clear on your priorities, your passion, your purpose, like just go get a job and just like work. Yeah. And then if it doesn't work out, like do something else. But like, my dad has still worked for the same guy 40 years later. And some of it is because he had to, and some of it is because he wants to, but most of it was because he had to.
Yeah.
So I think that's the opportunity, is to stop being so wacky about perfect. Like, don't let perfect ruin good, or good ruin perfect, or whatever the saying is. And I think that's the opportunity, is get connected on your priorities in your head, your passion, your heart, your purpose, and your gut.
Well, I think it fits into a lot of what I've seen, and I think it's timely that you're doing it, because I think there's this sort of no time better in history than to sort of take control, and I think that's what people are longing for, is feeling like they're in control. And I think even if you're at a place that you don't love, if you are structuring that experience there to learn something, great. One of the most amazing stats someone told me is, if you want to be able to predict if someone is basically happy at their job or not, you can ask, does your manager ask you, what are your long-term plans? They don't actually care whether they know that you're not going to stay there forever, but you just sort of want to know that people are sort of interested in what your long-term path is. And I think that the pushback, or the flip side of that is, well, then if they don't ask you, you should tell them, right? Like, you should tell them, listen, my long-term path, there's priorities that you laid out is this. And that sort of like opening this dialogue to put yourself in the driver's seat, I think is what sort of the missing piece today, is that people feel sort of like, well, I'm just out of control. I don't have control of it. Whereas I think today we really can have way more control over our own destiny.
Well, and I think part of it too is, all of us leaving that dopamine economy and going to more of the serotonin place, which is not looking for the quick fix, the instant gratification, the attainment of stock options. The company goes public and I never work again. We've all seen this script before, which is, NFL athletes, 70% of them, when they leave the NFL within a year, are broke or die. Lottery winners. We have this inherent, if I didn't earn it, I don't deserve it. And I think the idea that we'll ever be finished working is, I plan to live until I'm 126, God willing, and, no crazy accidents. And I think that's, you and me have that opportunity. So like, okay, I've got, 86 years left. Like, what am I going to do?
Yeah.
And, again, like the average lifespan has like tripled in the last couple hundred years. So yeah, you got one marriage, one career. Like, well, that's, you're not doing that anymore. I'm not saying, by the way, it all gets worse. I'm just saying, like, but the idea, though, I do think, this transformation moment we find ourselves in human history right now is like not relying on governments, not relying on your first pick, not relying on your first anything, because you might get a second chance at bat. Like right now is great. I mean, there's never been a better net for anybody listening to this. Chances are they got a pretty good social network under them that no one's going to go hungry, starve to death, or be sitting in a homeless shelter later.
Yeah. Well, and you at that rate, if you're going to live to 126, you may actually see another Ravens Super Bowl.
Yeah, come on. By the way, you're not a Redskins fan, are you?
I'm a Seattle fan. That's probably my team. Although I grew up in Nebraska, so I don't really have a team. I'm kind of like I can be a fair weather fan, because that's it,
Well, we need a wrap, because I'm heading to Seattle Monday, so we'll talk about it.
Yeah, for sure. And so I guess last thing is sort of when do we expect your next book out, and anything that we can do to help you?
It should be early March, Shift the Work. So we will I will get you all the details, but if you go to shiftthework.com, you'll see our site today, and then we'll probably ghost it for a bit and just be promoting the book hard. I think here's what I would say to anybody listening to this who's either read a book ever, has written a book ever, is go back and support the industry. And through just buying books, but like reviewing books. This has been kind of my pet peeve recently, which is, we all have to have each other's backs here. It's not that the industry is just declining. It's that, with the volume and velocity of different books that are coming out, it's like we sort of like, we kind of like hit it and forget it. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like go back and make sure, not because you're trying to throw just good karma out, but help people make good decisions on the next book that they read with the short lives that we have. I think that's, super important, not just for our book, but certainly anybody, and I think we sometimes forget the power of that somebody someday is going to read your review and go, I got to read that book. Yeah,
that's awesome. That's a good piece. I think that is, knowledge is best when it's shared. And so if you read something good or a piece of it, buy a book, give a book as a gift. I think it's a great reminder.
Right.
Awesome. Well, this has been fascinating. It's fun. I'm sure you and I could do this for hours. And like I said, now that you have a podcast coming out, I would love to repay the favor and the same thing. So please count on me for that one. But this has been super awesome. And I think I now have 4 or 5 more books that I'm going to add to my nightstand, which is great. And super excited for the next book and to sort of see what comes out. I think that there is a time and now place where there are just people trying to rethink their own life career, and it's the right time to be giving people the tools. So I'm excited to shift the work.
Awesome, brother. Thank you.